This is the War Memorial in Stratford, Ontario, and it's typical of all the war memorials across Canada, in every village, in every town, and in every city. And these memorials are gateways to the First World War. Unfortunately, most Canadians have forgotten the First World War, and they don't realize that it was the greatest and most traumatic episode in our history. 400,000 Canadians went overseas between 1914 and 18, and 60,000 died for King and Empire.
In these quiet woodlands, you can still find reminders of a great war, shell holes left from fierce battles fought here long ago. Muddy trenches where thousands of men struggled to the death. Each year brings more reminders, a dangerous, often deadly, harvest of steel.
That's a German shell, 21 centimeters.
Rising up through the soil are thousands of high explosive shells that farmers leave by the side of the road, lethal relics of one of the bloodiest battles in history.
It's 3-4 kilometers from Passchendaele, so it can be from the big Passchendaele fight. One of the battlefields of Passchendaele.
Summer 1917, Flanders. British troops unload millions of shells, preparing for the battle that will go down in history under the name Passchendaele. The British Commander-in-Chief, Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, is about to launch his greatest offensive yet, to liberate northern Belgium from the Germans and seize its channel ports. Attacking from the city of Ypres, Haig plans to capture the German-held ridges around the city and to send his cavalry galloping through shattered German lines and on to victory. For 10 days, 4 million shells thunder down on a few square kilometers of Flanders. Ordered to resist to the last man, German troops, like 22-year-old Ernst Junger, can only hunker down and pray they will survive.
We lay close to one another in the narrow and crowded ditch. Fire danced before our eyes. Twigs and clods whistled about our ears. Close on my left, a flash flared out, leaving a white, suffocating vapor. I crept on all fours to the man next to me. He moved no more. The blood trickled from many wounds caused by small, jagged splinters.
But Haig's bombardment, the biggest of the war, destroys the centuries-old drainage system of Flanders. And within days, the rains begin, pouring down upon the Field Marshal's battlefield.
We're standing on one of the most bloody, deadliest, infamous battlefields in history. And today it looks like this. The shelling over this period had destroyed all the creeks and all the drainage, like the little rave beak that's beside us here. And it just turned the whole thing into a sea of mud, or a treacherous morass. And soldiers who fell off duckboards would drown in the mud.
Mud rips the treads off Field Marshal Haig's tanks. His guns sink. His men and his mules drown. Whole armies are swallowed up. And Douglas Haig's great offensive flounders in a sea of stinking slime. Stubbornly, Haig decrees that the offensive will continue, and so it does, for almost 3 months. By October, the Field Marshal has lost 250,000 men, and the key ridge overlooking the city of Ypres, the ridge of Passchendaele, is still in German hands.
We're standing on what were the German positions on Passchendaele Ridge. From here you can see Ypres, 12 kilometers in the distance. And in these fields in 1917, the British Army suffered more than 250,000 casualties. Yet they had not reached this position. In mid-October 1918, Canadian troops were ordered north, and they were given the impossible task of capturing Passchendaele.
Since its victory at Vimy Ridge 6 months before, the Canadian Corps has been considered an elite force. But the price of victory had been heavy. Many are now new recruits, replacing the dead and the maimed. One of these fresh-faced rookies is a 22-year-old railway clerk from Ontario, John Harold Becker.
We were lined up for Ypres, and it had a bad reputation. Every minute brought us closer to the front and further into the great wastes that were Belgium. Tremendous traffic congested the road. Troops were everywhere, and the roadside estaminets were doing a thriving business. On the western edge of Ypres, we got out of our trucks and started our march.
When the Canadians enter Ypres, they can see for themselves how, after 3 years of war, the city has, like so much of the world, been reduced to rubble. Only soldiers trudge through the shattered streets. The population is gone. And of the world-renowned monuments, such as the Cloth Hall and the cathedral, only empty shells remain. The Gothic jewel of Flanders exists no more.
As we entered this city, we were spaced a considerable distance, each platoon moving by itself. There was only one route through Ypres, and this main road carried all the traffic to and from the great salient to the east. Every few minutes, a big shell landed somewhere in the neighborhood of the corner by the famous Cloth Hall, and at intervals, a whole salvo was planted in the city.
This is a large caliber German naval shell, one of the many types of shells that were lobbed on Ypres in 1915 and throughout the Great War. Fortunately, this one did not explode, because if it had, it would have blown out a big chunk of this building or made a crater about 25 feet wide.
When Agar Adamson, the commander of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, enters the desolate ruins of Ypres, his first concern is to find shelter for his men.
Dear Mabel, I shoved the men into what cellars could be found. I showed one of our new officers around the remains of the town. The shelling on both sides is most intense. The evening bombing accounted for some good dear fellows of another battalion. My love to you, ever thine, Agar.
This is Rampart Cemetery. It's at the southern end of Ypres, and it's one of the most beautiful cemeteries in the salient. This is the grave of Sapper Abe Borthwick of the Canadian Engineers, who was killed in action on the 16th of October 1917. Borthwick was one of the original men who came north from Vimy in preparation for the Passchendaele fighting. The men who came north, who had last been in Ypres in 1916, couldn't believe what they found here. It was all mud and total destruction, and the stench of death was everywhere. We're looking out over the moat here. This area was deadly. You couldn't show yourself during the day because of German shelling. There'd be bodies in the moats. The whole place was just demolished. It was hell on earth. The Canadian Corps were about 100,000 strong when they came north. The volunteers of 1914 were all dead or wounded or gone. And they brought up a new army, a very successful army, one that had won big victories at Vimy, Hill 70. This was a really cocky group, and these guys had a big challenge ahead of them when they came here at Ypres.
After a 3-month offensive to save his career, Field Marshal Haig has to justify his huge casualties with at least one tangible success. He orders the commander of the Canadian Corps, Arthur Currie, to capture Passchendaele Ridge. Calculating that the ridge will cost 16,000 Canadian casualties, Currie declares that Passchendaele is not worth one drop of blood. Stubbornly, Haig insists. He orders Currie to attack, and finally Arthur Currie promises his Canadians will take Passchendaele. Only when they relieve the Australians and New Zealanders do the Canadians realize the full horror of the battle. The Anzacs had fought their way to the foot of Passchendaele Ridge, and there they had been slaughtered. 38,000 casualties. The survivors look more like ghosts than men.
Dear Mabel, the condition of the ground beggars description. Just one mass of shell holes, all full of water. The strongest and youngest men cannot navigate without falling down. The people we relieved tell me in the attack a great many of their men were drowned in shell holes for want of strength to pull themselves out when dog-tired. Ever thine, Agar.
The battlefield of Passchendaele. Kilometers of mud, a naked, barren morass, all of it exposed to German guns and bombers. Looking out over the wasteland, General Arthur Currie, the Canadian commander, realizes what faces him. Just to get to the foot of Passchendaele Ridge, he will have to build a network of floating plank roads. He puts the troops to work, and 22-year-old John Harold Becker finds himself in a work party.
Daily, we plugged up that road, past the labor battalions working to fill in the new shell holes, and trying to keep the soupy mud below ankle depth. Past broken wagons and guns, past ambulances going out with the wounded, past bodies of young Canadians, English, Scotch, Irish, and Australians, past the smells of rotting flesh, past bodies that were more recent casualties, but looked the same in the color of the mud, the color of the blood. Our own party usually numbered 1 or 2 less than on the ingoing trip. A big shell zoomed in right alongside our path, and cries went up for a stretcher bearer. 2 men were killed outright, and Lance Corporal Bottomley had his right arm almost torn off. When I got to him, he was standing there calmly with a tight hold on the stump of his arm just above the wound. The rest of the arm was hanging by a couple of tendons. When he left with the other wounded fellows, he called out a cheery goodbye.
When Becker dashes to shelter in an improvised trench, gas shells explode in front of him. With his face and body scalded by mustard gas, Becker can't breathe. He becomes just one more casualty. But he is lucky. Soon he is in an ambulance, and for Harold Becker, the Battle of Passchendaele is over. As the floating plank roads near completion, German air attacks intensify. Gotha bombers pound the Canadian road builders. Private Will Bird, a veteran of Vimy Ridge, is caught out in the open as the Gothas sweep out of the clouds.
At that moment, over came two big black-winged German Gothas and dropped bombs. Some ammunition mules were packed in line on a shaky board road made of planks, and one bomb made a direct hit on a broad mule rump. The Gothas flew off, and we saw men push the three dead mules into the mud. Shambles of head and entrails were shoveled into the mire, and then the ammunition train went on. We kept on and arrived at a battery of 5 guns. The battery horses had drowned in mire as they tried to move the guns to the left, where a slight rise afforded more solid ground. So now, 13 men of the 42nd took hold of the rope and tried to pull a gun. It was tremendous labor. Each man had to keep getting a new footing, and often we sank in mud and water of gruel thickness until the slime rose above our hips. The only thing solid underneath was a huddled dead man, and we stumbled over 5 or 6 during the morning.
On Passchendaele Ridge, the Germans know that if they can slow the Canadians down until the winter rains arrive, they will have won the battle. Night and day, the German guns never stop firing, saturating the Canadians with high explosive, gas shells, and shrapnel. But non-stop the work goes on. Soon the roads are complete, and General Currie is ready to launch his attack. But approaching the ridge, his men face the Wraithbeak Creek, then a flooded and deadly morass. So Currie has to split his attack in 2, sending one division up Bellevue Spur to the north and another up Passchendaele Ridge to the south. And because the mud slows everything down, Currie plans the attack in 3 stages, separated by a pause of several days. And so Arthur Currie launches his 4 divisions against the highest point of the ridge, Passchendaele Village.
We're standing on the Bellevue Spur. This was the jump-off position for the Canadian attack on October 26, 1917. Up this ridge, approximately 4,000 Canadian soldiers went to attack the German positions. And on the far ridge over there, Passchendaele Ridge, another 4,000 were attacking. The attacks had to be 2-pronged because the ground in between was a morass of mud and impassable. The first day they managed to push ahead around 700 yards, which by Passchendaele standards were very good. But the casualties were about 3,000 killed and wounded, which was pretty good again for Passchendaele standards. But they had a lot more work to go before they got to the village over here.
As the men slog up the muddy slopes, Currie's massive creeping barrage is supposed to protect them. But the guns slip in the mud, lose their targets, and the shells fall short, as Private Pat Burns, a rookie with the 4th Division, soon discovers.
We were on the move forward. I had not gone far when I was hit on the back of the head by a fragment of one of our own shells. I believe there were as many casualties, if not more, caused by our own guns as were caused by enemy fire. I went over with, I think, 15 men in the Lewis machine gun section, and every man was hit besides me. A fellow by the name of Piercy and I were the only 2 survivors who got to the objective. We jumped into a big hole, and I had the machine gun, which I knew nothing about, and all the ammunition we could carry. And there we were, holding the front line.
The October 26th attack lasts a few hours. gains 1,000 meters and loses 3,000 men, 600 dead. For every 2 meters gained, a man dies. A fine success is how Field Marshal Haig describes the attack, and the men still have 2,000 meters to go. General Currie's first attack towards Passchendaele has carried the line forward 1,000 meters. For his second attack, Currie plans a forward leap of another 1,000 meters. Venturing out to inspect the battlefield is Agar Adamson of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry.
Dear Mabel, it rains or blows all the time. The condition of the ground is beyond words, and of course will be much worse after the barrage. I cannot see all the men together because we are under observation. I am delighted with the spirit of the men, and if human endurance can stand it, we should be successful. But, of course, this game is the biggest of big gambles, and no one can foresee the future. But I am hopeful the dear old regiment will play up to their very best. Ever thine, Agar.
Major Talbot Papineau, a wealthy French Canadian, often seen as a future Prime Minister. He has fought with the Princess Pats before, but is now safe in a staff job at headquarters. Just before the battle, Papineau decides to return to Ypres. His place, he feels, is with his regiment.
Dear Mother, I never felt so good. This morning we had a church service and sang Nearer My God to Thee, familiar of how we used to sing as kids at Montebello. No one ever played the piano as well as you. Dear little Mother, how pitifully little I seem to have seen of you. But we will find a fund of buried affection after the war. Talbot.
As Talbot Papineau and his men crouch in a shell hole, Arthur Currie unleashes the Canadian barrage. The Germans scramble for cover, hunkering down inside their pillboxes. Laid out in a checkerboard pattern, hundreds of these concrete blocks dot Bellevue Spur and Passchendaele Ridge.
Life in the cement block is hell. We are 11 men living here. Officers and other ranks share the lousy plank beds. The plague of flies is terrible. Waterlogged shell craters are full of cadavers. Attracted by this, the flies gather here by the thousands, invade the shelters, creep over hands and faces, and settle down on foodstuffs. One cannot risk being seen outside. And worst of all is the unbearable air. Captain Stefan Lubinski.
One of the symbols of the Passchendaele fighting was the German concrete pillbox. Here's a perfect example of one. And contrary to popular belief, the pillbox was not for machine gun operation. It was for infantry to be protected from enemy shelling. There were hundreds of these such pillboxes around Ypres during the war. Most were destroyed by the Belgians in the 1920s and 30s. This is a really good example of one. You can actually see the doorway here, and you can see in a little bit. Anyway, it's about 3 feet thick. So during the war, even a direct hit by a high explosive shell would do nothing to this at all. The reasons that Germans resorted to this form of bunker was because of the high water table in the area. They couldn't make existing dugouts because they would automatically fill with water. So their whole defense was based on a series of bunkers.
The bunkers could withstand even direct hits, but owing to ground conditions in the area, they could not be erected over a strong foundation. When a heavy shell opened a crater close to them, they would lean over, sometimes with the entrance down, with the soldiers trapped inside. There was no way of rescuing them, of course.
This is a series of 3. There may have been more. They would have been linked by a trench, lots of barbed wire. And they'd have one garrison for all 3 of them. This would be the machine gunners, maybe snipers, artillery observers. and they waited inside the bunker while the shelling was on, and as soon as the shelling was over, they'd come out to man the machine guns. They were very, very hard to get to because your artillery couldn't do anything to them. So really it came down to individual acts of bravery or small groups taking care of these positions.
Only by charging headlong at them or slithering right up to them can the Canadians hope to eliminate the pillboxes. And in the Passchendaele fighting, for these incredibly foolhardy acts of bravery, 9 Canadians are awarded the Empire's highest medal, the Victoria Cross. Men such as Captain Christopher O'Kelly of the 52nd Battalion, whose section eliminates 6 pillboxes and takes 100 prisoners. Scrambling out of their shelters, the Germans who survived the Canadian bombardment prepare for the Princess Pat's attack. At 0 hour, the German guns open up. Talbot Papineau turns to his friend, Major Hugh Niven, and says, "You know, Hughie, this is suicide." The moment the Princess Pats go over the top, they are engulfed in a firestorm. Attacking across these fields, the Pats lose 360 of their 600 men for an advance of 500 meters.
My dear Mabel, I am still all right and hanging on. Haggard, Papineau, Sullivan, Almond, all killed. I cannot help wondering if the position gained was worth the awful sacrifice of life. A pair of feet with reverse putties were seen sticking out of a shell hole full of water. Stewart said Major Papineau always wore his putties that way. They pulled the body out, and by examining the pockets, found it to be Papineau. He had been hit by part of a shell in the stomach, blowing everything else above away. Poor fellow. He would not have known what hit him.
Dear Colonel Adamson, please accept my sincere thanks for your letter and your sympathy. Every word said about Talbot, I read and reread, and in the expressions of admiration and esteem in which he was held, I find my only solace. The courage with which he faced what I am told was a desperate attack fills my heart with pride, but also with great bitterness. Nothing can console me for the loss of my boy. Sincerely yours, Carolyn Papineau.
While the 3rd Division and the Princess Pats fight their way up Bellevue Spur, the 4th Division advances through a hailstorm of German fire on Passchendaele Ridge. In the first few minutes, Nova Scotia's 85th Battalion loses almost all its officers.
This is the monument that commemorates the actions of the 85th Nova Scotia Highlanders on October 30th, 1917, in their action here against Passchendaele Village. On the 30th of October 1917, the 4th Division, including the 85th Nova Scotia Highlanders, launched a major attack on the Passchendaele Spur here, driving up closer to the village. They fought against uncut barbed wire, pillboxes, and just an incredible amount of mud. But they were successful in pushing the line closer to Passchendaele Village. This memorial commemorates all the dead of the 85th Nova Scotia Highlanders killed in that action right here on the 30th of October 1917. This was their worst day of the war. But the line was pushed closer to Passchendaele Village. They captured the small villages in here, and they were ready for a further assault on this village of Passchendaele itself. These fields are full of war material. Here's a hand grenade that was found by the local farmer. He's put it by the side of the fields for collection by the bomb disposal people. Here's another item. A French bullet, probably from 1914. This is another reminder of the Great War.
At the end of the second attack, the Canadians had pushed ahead 900 meters and suffered 2,300 casualties, including 900 dead. For each meter gained, one man has died. There are still 1,000 meters to go, and the Germans have brought in fresh troops to defend Passchendaele village to the last. The peaceful Belgian village of Passchendaele. In the fighting for Passchendaele, more people died than were killed by the atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Sitting near the highest point of the ridge, the village has become the final objective of Field Marshal Haig's great offensive. And the Field Marshal has sacrificed armies trying to get there. In Flemish, the word Passchendaele means the valley of Christ's passion, the valley where God died. And for months, Haig's guns pound the village, until in the end, he has reduced it to dust. With 1,000 meters to go, Canadian units are ordered out on night raids to eliminate the remaining obstacles to their final assault, planned for November the 6th.
We're on the Bellevue Spur, and this is the location of a night attack made by the 42nd Battalion on November the 3rd, 1917. During the attack, Will Bird and a group of his comrades were supposed to capture a German pillbox across the Passchendaele Road.
Never through the whole war was I more sickened and discouraged than at that moment. We were new in the sector. None knew the terrain, none knew what defenses the German had or his strength. The place after dark was a swampy wilderness without anything to use as a guide. Half the men had never been in an attack, and that included the officers. Furthermore, in those few minutes I discovered that Clark, as well as McIntyre, had had too much rum.
The 42nd had come into the line the night before. They had to cross the battleground of October the 30th, 1917, by the corpses of the PPCLI, including Talbot Papineau. The whole area was mud and shell holes. There were no landmarks, and that is why the Bird attack failed so miserably. Most of the men were either killed or wounded. It was a complete disaster.
There was a flaming white-hot instant and oblivion. When I recovered consciousness, my head was splitting with pain and a terrible nausea had seized my stomach. Lying there, we heard plunging noises in the mud and two dim figures came toward us, puffing and plowing, carrying something and grunting in conversation. They were Germans, big men, and had a machine gun on a tripod. I pulled the pin from one of my grenades, held it for a count of 2, then hurled it at the Germans and flattened myself in the mud. The bomb burst between the two gunners. One German never moved but lay on his back, dead. The other pawed at his side feebly for a time, then was still. We went on. They were all dead. Bailey and Ira and Jennings lying together, rifle in hand, all shot through the head by one sweep of a German gun.
The same night, other platoons attack. One Highlander platoon, Scotsmen all, is led by a Jew, Lieutenant Meyer T. Cohen, affectionately known to his men as Mac Cohen. Cohen takes his objective, and when the Germans counterattack, he dies defending it.
This is the grave of Meyer Cohen, an officer of the Black Watch of Canada, killed at Graf House on the 3rd of November 1917. He was one of the units of the 42nd that attacked up Bellevue Spur with Will Bird, and he was killed in action on that day. His body was found in 1919 and reburied here in Polkapelle British Cemetery, probably the loneliest British cemetery in the entire salient. There are more than 7,500 burials here, 83% are unknown. No one comes to this cemetery. They'll visit Tynecott and some of the other places, but this lonely place just leaves these men even further into oblivion.
November 6th, 1917. General Currie's final assault on Passchendaele. 6 a.m. Every Canadian gun opens fire. The barrage creeps forward, chewing up German defenses. Close behind the barrage, slogging through the mud, the men of the 1st Division fight their way up Bellevue Spur, while the men of the 2nd Division struggle along Passchendaele Ridge. One by one, in short, vicious fights, the German strongpoints fall. In one of many acts of wild bravery, Private James Robertson of the 27th Battalion from Winnipeg leaps barbed wire, bayonets 2 German machine gunners, and turns the gun against the fleeing Germans. Minutes later, Robertson is killed, sacrificing his life for Passchendaele, now nothing but a pile of burnt masonry and shattered bricks.
We're at the Canadian Battlefield Monument at Cress Farm. It commemorates the Battle of Passchendaele. This uninspiring design marks one of the bloodiest battles in the history of mankind. The inscription that commemorates the action reads, "The Canadian Corps in October-November 1917 advanced across this valley, then a treacherous morass captured and held the Passchendaele Ridge." The Battle of Passchendaele cost the Canadians 16,000 killed and wounded, but it was their most tenacious and most courageous battle of the entire war.
Canon Frederick Scott, the 57-year-old Canadian Army chaplain who has risked his life with the ordinary soldiers, now walks into the village of Passchendaele.
The whole region was unspeakably horrible. Bearer parties, tired and pale, were carrying out the wounded on stretchers. The bodies of dead men lay here and there where they had fallen. The huge shell holes were half full of water, often reddened with human blood, and many of the wounded had fallen into them and drowned. I went ahead and found, sitting in the mud of a trench, his legs almost covered with water, a lad who told me he had been there many hours. He was smiling most cheerfully and made no complaint about what he had suffered. One of the men asked him if he was hit in the legs. He said, yes, but the man looked up at me and, pulling up the boy's tunic, showed me a hideous wound in his back. They carried him off, happy and cheerful. Whether he recovered or not, I do not know.
We're at Tynecott British Cemetery. It's the largest Commonwealth cemetery in the world, and almost all the burials here are men who were killed in the Passchendaele fighting. It contains 1,000 Canadians as well, and these Canadians were all killed in the advance to Passchendaele village. The cemetery was established during the fighting at Passchendaele in 1917, but it was only a very small cemetery at that time. After the war, they brought in another 11,000 bodies from the surrounding battlefields, and now the cemetery contains close to 12,000, of which 70% are unknowns. The unknowns were our soldiers where they found the remains, but they could not give a name to them. They may identify the unit or the nationality, or sometimes that he was just British, but they could never actually determine what the man's name was. going to try to find the grave of J.P. Robertson. Robertson won his Victoria Cross in the capture of Passchendaele Village, but he was killed in the action. Here it is. Private J.P. Robertson, V.C., 27th Battalion Canadian Infantry, City of Winnipeg, 6th of November 1917, age 35. His family put an inscription on the bottom of the stone. Behold, how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. And it's obviously put in by his mother. The headstone is unique to those who won the Victoria Cross. Private H. Phillips, 102nd Battalion Canadian Infantry, killed in action 30th October 1917. He would have been killed at Crest Farm. R.P. Barr, 38th Battalion Canadian Infantry, they're from Ottawa. He was killed in action 30th October 1917 and he was 19 years old. Well, I think this is the story of the Battle of Passchendaele, the dead and the cemeteries. The plan to break through to the Channel ports was an excellent one. Started off with some promise, and then it died out here in the fields, in the mud, and the barbed wire. To sit here and see Ypres 10 kilometers away, and to think that 300,000 men were killed and wounded, to get only this far is just an incredible testament to failure.
Under Sir Arthur Currie, the Canadians captured Passchendaele on schedule and according to plan. The day Passchendaele falls, Field Marshal Haig's Chief of Staff phones Arthur Currie and asks, "Is it true that the village has fallen?" "Yes," Currie answers. "Thank God," is the reply. The British newspapers hail a great British victory. The career of Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig is saved. Taking Passchendaele had cost 16,000 Canadian casualties, precisely what Arthur Currie had predicted. For the German High Command, the loss of Passchendaele is a disaster. They are now determined to blast the Canadians from the ridge that has already cost so much blood. The Canadians have taken Passchendaele, but it is nothing but a pile of muddy bricks. With the other men of the 42nd Battalion, Will Bird and his buddy Mickey are sent to hold the line, while the Germans use every gun they have to blast the Canadians off the ridge.
We got out and went on down the road, and there came a salvo of whiz-bangs. As the last soul-tearing smash crashed in my ears, I saw Mickey spin and fall. I jumped to him. He had been hit in several places and could not live 10 minutes. "Mickey, Mickey!" I called his name and raised him up, and he nestled to me like a child. "I'm through," he said. "I don't want to kill people anyway. Tell my mother." His voice was so low I could not hear, but his lips still moved.
Will Byrd wrote one of the most graphic memoirs in the First World War. He served throughout the war with the 42nd Battalion, and in his memoir he mentions 120 of his friends and comrades, of which 60 were killed in the Great War. One of his best friends is buried here at Oxford Road Cemetery. This is it here. Lance Corporal D. McIlvery, 42nd Battalion Canadian Infantry, 17th November 1917, age 33. One of the most graphic parts of his book describes holding the Passchendaele Ridge after the village had fallen. And the Canadians were wide open and the German shelling just ripped them apart. And this is where Mickey got killed, on the way back from the front. Byrd was pretty cut up about this. For a man who was pretty used to death, this one hurt him pretty badly. Sadly, he'd see a lot more of his friends go in 1918.
When the battalions returned from Passchendaele, their officers were often shocked to discover that only a handful of men were left. Only slowly did the survivors begin to consider themselves human beings. But no man who had endured Passchendaele would ever be the same again. He would forever be a stranger to himself.